Good afternoon. We just clocked 1:30 in the afternoon this Monday. I found a specimen of the Klein bottle, and here you can see part contained. Turn it upside down. What Rosen and Ryan puts as the subject going into the contained. And here you see a different experience or perception. And I think this is actually needed. I do 100% agree with Rosen and also Jan, our friend in Israel, Rapoport, that without that one you will, for your fantasy, your imagination, your experiencing, be in the idea of object, space and subject. The contained, the container and the uncontained. But here, elegantly, you see they slid into each other, and oddly enough, their differences are dependent on them being the same. And this is exactly the point of Heraclitus. And I think the lack of a Klein bottle had made it impossible to fully appreciate the geniality of Heraclitus. And what he says is to be taken to the letter. It is not metaphorical, it is not a trope, it is exactly how it is. Opposites makes it possible for opposites to be opposites, but at the same time stemming from the very same thing. This is why space is actually constructed that way. I will continue on the article. There will be a link in the description where you can download for your own read. I'll go to the three parts of this structure thus flow into one another in a continuous self-containing movement that flies in the face of the Cartesian division of contained, containing and uncontained. Symbolically of object, space and subject. We can also see an aspect of discontinuity in the diagram. At the juncture where the part uncontained passes into the part contained, the structure must intersect itself. Would this not break the figure open, rendering it simply discontinuous? While this is indeed the case for a Klein bottle conceived as an object in ordinary space. Properly seen, the Klein bottle actually enacts a dialectic of continuity and discontinuity. As will become clearer in further exploring this peculiar structure. We can say then that in its highly schematic way, the one-dimensional diagram lays out symbolically the basic terms of a continuously discontinuous dialectic involving not only subject and object, psyche and matter, but the mediating space as well. Depicted here is the process by which the three-dimensional object of the submicroscopic realm in the act of containing itself is transformed into the subject. This blueprint for psychophysical interrelatedness gives us graphic indication of how the mutually exclusive categories of classical thought are surpassed by a relation of mutual inclusion. The paradoxical nature of the Klein bottle finds expression in its surprising property of one-sidedness. More commonplace topological figures such as the sphere and the torus are two-sided. Their opposing sides can be identified in a straightforward, unambiguous fashion. Therefore, they meet the classical expectation of being closed structures, structures whose interior regions parts contain remain interior. In the contrasting case of the Klein bottle, inside and outside are freely reversible. Thus, while the Klein bottle is not simply an open structure, neither is it simply closed. as are the sphere and the torus. In studying the properties of the Klein bottle, we are led to a conclusion that is paradoxical from the classical viewpoint. This structure is both open and closed. The Klein bottle therefore helps to convey to us the fluid relationships between inside and outside, closure and openness, continuity and discontinuity that are lost to us in Cartesian experience. However, must the self-containing one-sidedness of the Klein bottle be seen as involving the spatial container? Granting the Klein bottle's symbolic value, could we not view its inside outflow from part contained to part containing merely as a characteristic of an object that itself is simply inside of space? With space continuing to play the classical role of that which contains without being contained. In other words, despite its suggestive quality, does the Klein bottle not lend itself to classical idealization as a mere object in space just as much as any other structure? The schematic representation of the Klein bottle provided by Figure 3 shows that it possesses the curious property of passing through itself. When we consider the actual construction of a Klein bottle in three-dimensional space, by joining one boundary circle of a cylinder to the other from the inside, we are confronted with the fact that no structure can penetrate itself without cutting a hole in its surface. An act that would render the model topologically imperfect or simply discontinuous. So the Klein bottle cannot be assembled effectively when one is limited to 3 dimensions. Mathematicians observe that a form that penetrates itself in a given number of dimensions can be produced without cutting a hole if an added dimension is available. The point is imaginatively illustrated by Rudolf Rocker. He asks us to picture a species of flatlanders attempting to assemble a Möbius strip, which is a lower dimensional analog of the Klein bottle. Rucker shows that since the reality of these creatures would be limited to 2 dimensions, when they would try to make an actual model of the Möbius, they would be forced to cut a hole in it. Of course, no such problem with Möbius construction arises for us human beings who have full access to 3 external dimensions. It is the making of the Klein bottle that is problematic for us, requiring as it would a 4th dimension. Try as we might, we find no 4th dimension in which to execute this operation. In contemporary mathematics, however, the fact that we cannot create a proper model of the Klein bottle in 3-dimensional space is not seen as an obstacle. The modern mathematician does not limit him or herself to the concrete reality of space, but feels free to invoke any number of higher dimensions. Notice, though, that in summoning into being these extra dimensions, the mathematician is extrapolating from the known three-dimensionality of the concrete world. This procedure of dimensional proliferation is an act of abstraction that presupposes that the nature of dimensionality itself is not altered. Do remember this. This is incredibly important point made by Rosen here. That the fourth dimension is an abstraction. We take it for granted, and we take it for granted that we can add it without changing the three dimensions we already have. In the case of the Klein bottle, the fourth dimension required to complete its formation remains an extensive continuum. An infinitely dense, structureless substrate that itself does not change, but that mediates changes in the structured objects it contains. To be sure, the fourth dimension is acknowledged as but a formal construct, and the Klein bottle is regarded as an abstract mathematical object simply contained in this hyperspace. Whereas the sphere, torus and Möbius strip are relatively concrete mathematical objects, since tangibly perceptible models of them may be successfully fashioned in three dimensions. We see here how the conventional analysis of the Klein bottle unswervingly adheres to the classical formulation of objects in space. Moreover, whether a mathematical object must be approached through hyperdimensional abstraction, or it is concretizable. The mathematician's attention is always directed outward toward an object. Toward that which is cast before his or her subjectivity. What Rosen is pointing to here, by itself already before a mathematician starts his mathematical education, that is already the approach. This is the aspect of the classical stance that takes subjectivity as the detached position from which all objects are viewed. Here, never is subjectivity as such opened to view. Thus, the posture of contemporary mathematics is faithfully aligned with that of Descartes and Newton in whatever topic it may be addressing. Always there is the mathematical object. A geometric form or algebraic function. The analytically continuous space in which the object is contained. And the seldom acknowledged uncontained subjectivity of the mathematician who is carrying out the analysis. And there is never any doubt about the strict separation of these three basic categories. How aptly put, I might say. Never has it become clearer than in this instance. Now, in his study of topology, Barr advised that we should not be intimidated by the higher mathematician. We must not be put off because he is interested only in the higher abstractions. We have an equal right to be interested in the tangible. The tangible fact about the Klein bottle that is glossed over in the higher abstractions of modern mathematics is its whole. I take a little summary there because this is just sheer excellence. Always, no matter what the mathematician, the physicist, the biologist, any scientist, any student, teacher, master, professor, everyone comes with a perception that the object is detached and cast before them in uncontained space for the subject to perceive, to experience, to analyze, to understand, or as Ian would have it, to grasp it, to fixate it as an own detailed in empty, uncontained area, often called space. This could be called a live questioning of that. Another possibility, not coming from abstraction, but from space itself. Obviously, here the contained and the containee are at one instance in the movement the same, but at another instant highly separated, as different as can be, and making it possible for us to take in the object isolated away from us. But we forget the connection. And I would say the most excellent point here is that we abstract the fourth dimension from our regular 3 dimensions. Assuming that we do not change the 3 dimensions we already have, and also that the 4th dimension would be in some way perpendicular to the other 3. And I have to be honest, I never thought about that before until this very moment. Not at all. This is the first time it strikes me, and I feel literally stricken by it. I would say it's an assumption I never made, but it's still there of my experience. Let's see, maybe there is a question before Kalle leaves us here.
Hand me also the lamp, please. Hello. And let's imagine that we had wine inside. Or rather, let me speak about wine. So in another publication by Rosen, he makes a word play between whole with a W in the beginning and a whole without the W. And that is a appropriate word play between whole with W and without the W, whole. And here you have the whole, but it's also part of the whole. And this made me think about wine. So what does this have to do with wine? Yes, so the ancient Greek word for wine is oinos, or pronounced in a modern Greek pronunciation as inos. And it's related to the English word for wine, although it's spelled completely differently, oinos. It doesn't look anything like the English word wine, but still they are related. In the beginning, we know that there was, in the beginning of Oinos, there was a W, you call it a Greek digamma. The technical term is digamma, and it's wow W, it corresponds to wow W. So like in wine, you have the W, and it has disappeared in ancient Greek. But it's a significant absence. Here we need an absence to explain the whole, that is the linguistic family of that the Greek is related, that Greek and English are related. So oinos, that is without the digamma, the whole, it has a whole in the form of a absent W, digamma. And I think Clanbottle also explains a linguistic problem. Whole and a whole, so that everything goes together. Thank you. Hans, do you want to add something?
Yes. How do you cope with absence in etymology? Well, you have to. And I think absence is always around the corner. It is different, it's taking part. And another author we looked into earlier, Terence Deacon, said that we do not acknowledging that absence, like in the word wine or enos, is constitutive, it's part of the thing. Whereas normally we see non-being, as Parmenides would have it, as only what is around a thing, or possibly what potentiates a thing. But Terence Deacon so aptly points out, as Kalle now reiterated, it's a constitutive thing, otherwise the word would not be understood and its history would be in darkness still. You find those things everywhere. I found them in history. When you look at the explanation for a historical event, the absence is usually ignored. Could be two reasons for that. Of course, absence can be hard to find. That I accept, but there is a general tendency only to count with what is present. And we know from quantum mechanics that is far from enough. It's a secondary thing, existence. It can help us to a certain degree, but essentially it is a random take on reality. Insufficient to get sufficient knowledge to understand movements, what happens, what the world is. Making do with Ziondas or existences will make us grasp. I think there is a reason for the grasping that Ian McGilchrist pointed out, and that is thirst for knowledge, thirst for wholeness with both a W and not a W. It is the whole that actually leads us to the whole. And I will continue with the whole a little bit more and make a small summary on the whole as well.
Boss.
Because the standard approach has always presupposed extensive continuity. It cannot come to terms with the inherent discontinuity of the Klein bottle created by its self-intersection. Therefore, all too quickly, higher mathematics circumvents this concrete whole by an act of abstraction in which the Klein bottle is treated as a properly closed object embedded, this is good, in a hyperdimensional continuum. It is, my commentary is almost like the lingering fantasy of ours of the fourth dimension is what is the container of the Klein bottle. It comes into presence and it surrounds it. And this is the hyperdimensional continuum. Also, implicit in the mainstream approach is the detached subjectivity of the mathematician before whom the object is cast. I suggest that by staying with the whole, we may bring into question the classical intuition of object in space before subject. Let us look more closely at the hole in the Klein bottle. What kind of hole is it? This loss of continuity is necessary. One certainly could make a hole in the Möbius strip, torus, or any other object in three-dimensional space. But such discontinuities would not be necessary inasmuch as these objects can be properly assembled in space without rupturing them. It is clear that whether such objects are cut open or left intact the closure of the space containing them will not be brought into question. In rendering these objects discontinuous, we do not affect the assumption that space in which they are embedded is simply continuous. With the Klein bottle, it is different. Its discontinuity does not speak to the supposed continuity of three-dimensional space itself. For the necessity of the hole in the bottle indicates that space is unable to contain the bottle the way ordinary objects appear containable. We know that if the Kleinian object is properly to be closed, assemble without merely tearing a hole in it, an added dimension is needed. Thus, for the Klein bottle to be accommodated, it seems the three-dimensional continuum itself must in some way be opened up. Its continuity opened to the challenge. Of course, we could attempt to sidestep the challenge by continuity maintaining act of abstraction. As in the standard mathematical analysis of the Klein bottle. Assuming we do not employ this stratagem, what conclusion are we led to regarding the higher dimension that is required for completing the Klein bottle. If it is not an extensive continuum, what sort of space or dimension is it? The question can be addressed by looking once more at the figure 3. At first glance, we see a schematic line drawing of a Klein bottle contained within the two-dimensional frame of the illustration. But when we consider the actual content of the diagram, we see that instead of showing the Klein bottle as an object enclosed in space, the diagram portrays space, part containing, as an aspect of the Klein bottle. What is symbolized schematically in figure 3 is a dimension of a Kleinian kind. One in which space itself is but one of 3 ontological terms, all of which flow together rather than being split off from one another as happened with the Cartesian paradigm. Of object in space before subject. It is clear from this that the Kleinian dimension is not physical, but psychophysical. For here, subject and object, psyche and physical matter are mediated by space in which they permeate each other. So I am proposing that when the Klein bottle is regarded in concrete terms, rather than as a mathematical abstraction, we actually cannot complete its construction as an object in special continuum. But are obliged to reformulate dimensionality itself along Kleinian lines. Note that in this reformulation, the hole in the Klein bottle is neither lightly dismissed in the interest of maintaining continuity, nor does continuity give way to sheer discontinuity. Instead, the very splitting of continuity and discontinuity is called into question, and we entertain the proposition that in completing the Klein bottle, in making it whole, it does not lose its whole. Grasped in this dialectical way, we may say in fact that the Klein bottle constitutes a whole with W and without it, a paradoxical structure in which continuity and discontinuity are intertwined. This can be clearly seen here. And as more as you think of it or perceive it, the less it seems to be paradoxical, forbiddingly impossible, not of this world. And we start to think, this is how the world is. It is a little bit like the mirage of the fourth dimension is yielding, leaving, not having the same influence on our experience. I would say that stuckedness, or as Ian McGilchrist calls it, stickness. That stickness, it's part and parcel of the subject trying to perceive the object in uncontained space. Trying vehemently, harshly. It has a grim feature. It's forced in a way. It does not come about easily. It's not smooth between discontinuous and continuous. I think this is one of the reasons why it's so hard to understand Planck's constant. It seems for bids continuity. To get over that, we need to go to the before, when the experience of the separatedness starts. And then we will see that the quantum effect doesn't take away continuity. Continuity is still possible. It doesn't have to be linear anymore to be continuous. Discontinuity can go hand in hand with continuity. A logic that René Descartes couldn't fathom. He didn't have a Klein bottle in front of him. Then you are stuck and you become sticky. Both the object and contained space get the sense of friction and stickiness. And this certain stickiness is what the all paradigm is experientially. It's not flowing. The movement and the telos doesn't happen by itself. The divisions somehow in that understanding, in that attitude, seem impossible. As impossible as lifting oneself in one's own hair. It is simply impossible. Stephen Rosen so far has eloquently and clearly, in his lovely writing style, showed it is what reality is. Once we loosen the perceptive fixatedness of subject in front of object in space, everything becomes easier. Once more, there is air to breathe. It's a sense of liberation. All things remain the same. Not a single thing changed. But in the demeanor of one's understanding, everything changes. This is opening up both the subject and the object side, making it more accessible, making way for more understanding, less grasping. And once you begin to understand that, your knowingness doesn't become as sharp and aggressive, fixated, greedy to own the knowledge. Instead, you are in the whole thing, especially when you start to realize that distinction is oddly enough made possible by being a whole. It's completely different. It's another thing I had to say immediately. It's definitely as different can be, but at the same time, oddly enough, remaining the very same. It goes within the present knowledge, although it seems to be an after. It opens up from the inside, even though it seemed at first come from the outside, from the articles Stephen M. Rosen or from the Klein bottle. But all of a sudden one sees it does actually come from the inside as well, from our very experience. And this is why the before the arche perception is foundational. This is from where it all stems originally. It comes from that departure. And then it expands from inside and outside at the very same time. We no longer have to choose between inside and outside in the opening movement. And we see that movement is inherent. Compare that to the Cartesian model, where movement is only within and doesn't make any sense, just like in Zenon's paradox. Movement seemed to be impossible, as it was for most of the Greek philosophers and for us. It becomes merely an abstraction, and time itself becomes something external, projected onto the facts. This is also breathing out. It is almost like the bottle itself is respiring, breathing, moving. A live universe, in contrast with a deadened universe with things hardly moving about, and if they do, not by their own will. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.